And we're back. So this session is called Science to Survive by Calming Animal Nutrition and Health.
Well, good morning, folks. It's good to speak to you today about the topic of compensatory growth. It's not a new area, so I'd hardly define it as innovative. I can remember discussing it as an undergraduate 50 years ago, believe it or not. I should have had the thought. But it seems to be an area of some topical interest in swine production. So I'm going to try and give you my thoughts on that over the next few minutes. A number of terms that are used in the literature to describe compensatory growth. Perhaps in the US, the most widely used is catch-up growth. It's actually used extensively in ruminant production, particularly forage-based systems where you get substantial seasonal variation in the quantity and quality of feed, where during the winter months or dry season, animals will be fed a relatively low quality conserved fodder and grow relatively slowly and then compensate and grow rapidly when they're, for example, in England, turned out onto grass in the spring, and the quantity and quality of feed increases dramatically. And a question I'm trying to address today is compensatory growth important in pigs, in species where the seasonal variation in quantity and quality of feedstuffs is relatively limited. As with all things, I think it's important to define what we mean by various terms. And so this is my attempt to define what we mean by compensatory gain in pigs or any species for that matter. There are a number of components to it. Obviously, first of all, we have a period of restricted growth. We then remove the restriction, growth rate accelerates. But the key aspect of this is growth rates for compensatory growth to occur have to be higher, have to exceed those achieved by comparable unrestricted animals. And this graphic here is an attempt to illustrate that definition. And what we have here is the changes in live weight with age and time in any animal in the classic sigmoid growth curve, which is the theoretical growth curve of an animal in an unlimited environment, if you like, the animal's genetic potential. We bring in a period of restriction during which growth rate is reduced. Here I've suggested growth rate goes to zero, but in practice it would probably in most situations be positive. At the end of the restriction period, we remove the factor that's restricting growth, and then the animal starts to grow more rapidly. And I've illustrated two situations here. The red line, that increase in live weight parallels the line for the unrestricted animals. In other words, the growth rate of those animals would be exactly the same as comparable unrestricted animals. That would not be compensatory growth. The blue line, on the other hand, illustrates compensatory growth in that the slope of this is greater than for the unrestricted animal. And so the animal's growth there is exceeding those of comparable unrestricted pigs, for example. And if you look in the literature on compensatory growth, I think the overall conclusion, certainly that I come to, is that it's very variable in terms of the response of animals during the recovery period. It goes from 0 to 100% and any degree in between that. So a very variable response. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we might expect that response to be somewhat variable. I just want to point out that in the main we talk about nutrition as being the restricting factor, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that case. We have other aspects of the animal's environment that can also restrict its growth. Do pigs show compensatory growth? And I wanted to start off that discussion by describing to you what I would class as a classic experiment that was carried out in the 1960s at Cambridge University in England, that then was a major animal science centre by Dr. David Lister, who is a gentleman I had the privilege of working with during my early career in the UK. And the study that David carried out was that he took pigs at about 3 weeks of age It's illustrated in these photographs. The top photograph is pigs at about 3 weeks of age, 5.5 kilos weight. The ones on the left, he put on full feed and allowed them to grow to mature size. The one on the right was put on a restricted feeding regime, severely restricted feeding regime, and was kept at that weight for 1 year. Incredible as that may sound, that's actually what they did. And as you can see, the pigs are approximately the same size, but anatomically, there are some significant differences, as you might expect from that extreme treatment. You then put these restricted pigs onto full feed and followed their growth. And somewhat remarkably, it still is amazing to me, those pigs reached a size and composition that was very, very similar to the unrestricted animal. And there'll be a prize at the end of this presentation for the first person to pick out which of these 2 pigs was unrestricted and which one was actually restricted. But the conclusion from that study is pigs, like all species, have an incredible capacity to recover from periods of restricted growth. So we perhaps shouldn't be surprised that pigs do show compensatory gain, not in all situations, but in many. I'd like to perhaps just address a question that always comes up when we talk about compensatory growth, is what happens to feed efficiency during compensatory growth? So the traditional view, certainly that applied in my earlier career, was we should really grow pigs as rapidly as we possibly can. We don't have seasonal variation in the quality and quantity of feed, nor much seasonal variation in costs. And so the more rapidly we grow them, the better the feed efficiency will be. Conceptually, that makes a lot of sense, because every day that a pig spends on the unit comes with a maintenance requirement that increases feed requirements. And if we want to maximize feed efficiency, which we obviously do, then grow them quickly, get them off the farm as quickly as possible. However, the evidence from studies with compensatory growth shows that during the recovery period, pigs can actually have greater efficiency than comparable animals. And we could talk about why, but I'll not go into that here. And if you look at the overall growth period, often the feed efficiency of pigs that have been restricted and compensated and their carcass composition at slaughter are very similar to those that you get with rapidly growing pigs. And so I think that allows us to talk about what is the lowest cost growth curve for pigs. As I've said, I think the literature in relation to compensatory growth shows extreme variability, everything from 0 to 100% compensation to restriction in growth early in the growth curve. And if we think about the factors that can affect both the growth of the pigs during the restriction period and during the recovery period, it's perhaps not surprising. Listed some of the factors here. I don't have the time to go into all of these, but the conditions during the restriction period, the method of restriction, conditions during recovery, a range of animal factors potentially could influence the animal's response to compensatory growth. And I'll just illustrate how that could have an effect by an example from nutritional restriction. One of the key factors or key changes during the period of restriction is what happens to the gastrointestinal tract and associated organs. That influences the animal's response to the period of restriction. And if we think about different nutritional approaches, for example, if we use feeding level and we reduce feeding level, that's likely to reduce the size of the GI tract. If we feed high fiber diets, reduce nutrient density to reduce growth, that's likely to have the opposite effect, increase the size of the gastrointestinal tract. And if we feed low protein diets, perhaps lysine deficient diets, it's been shown in a number of studies have very little effect on the size of the gastrointestinal tract. So you'd have animals in a much different composition in terms of their GI tract at the end of that restriction period, and in theory would respond differently in the recovery period, particularly in relation perhaps to the feed intake response. So given that great variability, I think it's difficult to come to general conclusions about compensatory growth, but I think we know enough about it and have done enough research to pinpoint some commercial opportunities perhaps where we exploit compensatory growth, maybe doing that already, but where the opportunities occur. And I think the opportunities to me are in three areas. First of all, minimizing feed costs. Example of that would be feeding lysine deficient diets during the nursery period. Animals will compensate during growing and finishing, and you can get similar overall performance, but reduce the costs of the nursery diets. Potentially has an added advantage of feeding lower protein diets in the nursery and reducing the potential for some enteric problems from higher crude protein diets. Another example of that would be to reduce the number of dietary phases in growth finishing. Increasing number of studies, we've done 3 or 4 of these recently, that show that feeding one diet during growth finishing can achieve the same performance as feeding 5 phases. Pigs have reduced performance early on because they're undersupplied with protein, but compensate later on. And that approach can minimize costs associated with diet manufacture and distribution. I think there are opportunities to exploit compensatory growth to increase facility output. Example would be overstocking in wean to finish facilities where you put 2, sometimes 3 times as many pigs into that space and then split those animals down at the end of the nursery period. And that approach has been shown to decrease performance during nursery when you have the larger groups in there. But once you reduce that group size, the pigs compensate and you end up with pretty close to the same overall growth performance, and obviously increase the weight of pigs produced from that facility. I think you can also use and do also use compensatory gain to manage variation of weighted slaughter. We've done a number of studies in this area. As we're aware, as pigs get towards the end of finishing, floor space often reduces growth. If we remove the heaviest pigs from the pen, perhaps 10, 15, 20% of those pigs, we will see a major increase in growth, somewhere between 10 and 15% on average, and an increase in feed efficiency in the pigs that are left in the pen. And so that increase in growth gets more of those pigs into the required weight window than if you left the pens intact. So a number of opportunities, I think, where we're already exploiting compensatory gain in pigs. I wanted to finish off by touching on what I've called the opposite case, where we might look to accelerate the growth of pigs, particularly early in the animal's growth curve. And I'm talking about pre-weaning and post-weaning. Number of tried and tested approaches to doing that. For example, pre-weaning, we might use creep feeding. We might feed liquid milk replacer, for example. Might be management approaches like reducing litter sizes, that weaning the heaviest pigs early and leaving the lighter pigs to grow for a few more days. Post-weaning, we might try liquid milk replacer again in the early post-weaning period, or feeding a liquid diet or a gruel type of feeding system, as illustrated in the diagram on the right of the slide. Without exception, all of these approaches have shown increases in weight at weaning or early in the post-weaning period. We've done a number of studies again in these areas, and we've had increases as high as 20% in weight at a fixed time, either at weaning or in the early post-weaning period. However, invariably, when we remove that stimulus, that source of the accelerated growth, the pigs come back to the growth of the control pigs. And if you look at overall performance, it's difficult to find evidence that that increased weight at weaning or early post-weaning is maintained to slaughter weight. I don't know if that's due to compensatory gain in the controls or reduced gain in the treated pigs, or a combination of the two. Now, I'm by no means suggesting that you should not use these techniques. I think they are potentially valuable, but I think they're more valuable for reducing pre-weaning and post-weaning mortality than they are for increasing overall growth performance. And with that, I'll draw some conclusions. As I've said, I think in pigs and in other species, compensatory growth is a complex area. I think it's poorly understood. In reality, we don't do on a world basis much in the way of fundamental research to understand pig growth in the way that it was done many years ago. I'm not so sure we're going to understand it in the foreseeable future. It certainly doesn't always occur, and it's not always favorable. But I think it can be an important tool for producers to use to minimize costs and maximize output from finishing pigs. And with that, I'll leave you with a photograph, a favorite of mine. It's a happy pig in the Dominican Republic, and I'll hand it back to Márcio. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. This is a great topic, and I love what you said about the mortality. I think around the globe, very often people get confused, thinking that we need that growth in that first week, but really we need to focus on that mortality. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think the best metric for post-weaning performance is mortality, morbidity, and mortality. Unfortunately, in a research setting, as you're aware, it's not easy to measure. It's easy enough to measure, but it's difficult to get the number of animals that you need to pick up commercially important differences. I think growth post-weaning, if growth post-weaning is positively associated with mortality, then so be it. But I think focus on mortality is more critical.
Very good. Dan Bussiers is asking, is there anybody in the industry that apply the compensatory growth concept in commercial large-scale production?
I'm an academic, so I know nothing of large-scale commercial production, but I would say yes. I mean, I see examples such as some of the opportunities that are highlighted there. I see those being used very regularly. Not all of them, but some of them for sure.
Yes, and I think several folks would feed a little less lysine early finishing than the books would call for. And if pigs have enough time to catch up, that's plenty. And also Dr. Mike Tokash comment in the comment session here about the slow growth situation that we had to create with COVID. And those pigs caught up a little slower, but they caught up.
Yeah, again, that was the opposite, trying to slow them down. In commercial systems, it's not as easy as we would like it to be, perhaps, in that situation.
Right. Very good. A last question is, what about health? This is from Alberto Casarin.
Sure.
What about health and undernutrition status in programs for compensatory growth?
That's a hell of a good question. I don't have an answer to it. I don't think that we understand the effect of health on the animal's ability to compensate. And I think it would depend on the disease challenge and the severity of the disease challenge. I have to say a lot of the studies that we've done have been done under commercial conditions that I would say would be normal health status, certainly not high health status. And we still see compensatory gain. But in terms of the response to pigs to a specific disease challenge in terms of compensation, I think it would depend on the long-term effects of that disease.
That makes total sense. I just remember now Dr. Mariana Menegat has done a very recent review on the topic, and I believe what she said is between 10 to 30% reduction in lysine yearly finishing seemed to be good. I wouldn't go all the way up to 30, but doesn't answer the health question, which is probably going to depend on disease. But thanks so much, Dr. Ellis.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.